You wake up on Christmas morning, 1685, somewhere in Protestant England. There's no tree, no stockings, no carols drifting through frosted windows, just silence. The kind that sits heavy on your chest like a wet wool blanket. The kind that makes you wonder if you've gone deaf overnight. You lie there, staring at the ceiling beams, watching your breath turn to vapor in the freezing air. Outside, the streets are empty. No children laughing. No vendors hawking roasted chestnuts. No bells ringing from the church tower. Because Christmas, the Christmas you think you know, with its glittering excess and manufactured joy, doesn't exist here. It's been cancelled. Not by Scrooge, not by the Grinch, by Parliament. In 1644, the English Parliament, drunk on Puritan zeal and political paranoia, officially banned Christmas. The Feast of the Nativity, they declared, was nothing more than a popish abomination, a relic of Catholic decadence wrapped in pagan ritual. Feasting, forbiddance, decorations, sacrilege. Singing? You might as well be summoning demons from the depths of hell itself. For over a decade, Christmas in England was illegal. Shopkeepers were ordered to keep their businesses open on December 25th. Churches stayed dark and cold, their doors bolted shut. Families who dared to roast a goose or hang a wreath of holly risked fines, imprisonment, or worse, the quiet, creeping judgment of their neighbors. And in a world where reputation was everything, where community surveillance was tighter than any police force, that judgment could destroy you. The Puritans didn't just dislike Christmas, they feared it. Because Christmas, at its core, was chaos. It was misrule. It was the one day a year when the social order flipped upside down, when servants mocked their masters, when drunkenness was not just tolerated but expected, when the poor demanded gifts from the rich as a matter of right, not charity. It was a safety valve for a society built on rigid hierarchy, and the Puritans wanted that valve welded shut. They saw Christmas as dangerous, a threat to godliness, to productivity, to the very fabric of social control. So they killed it, or tried to. But here's the thing about banning joy. It doesn't disappear. It just goes underground. By 1685, the ban was technically over. Charles II had restored the monarchy in 1660, and with it, a cautious, half-hearted return to Christmas traditions. The theaters reopened. The churches rang their bells again. People could legally gather, feast, and celebrate without fear of arrest. But the damage was done. An entire generation had grown up without Christmas. They didn't know the songs their grandparents had sung, didn't know the rituals that had once bound communities together, didn't know how to celebrate something that had been systematically erased from memory for more than 15 years. Think about that. 15 years. If you were born in 1644, you turned 16 before Christmas was legal again. You had no memory of the holiday, no lived experience of it, just stories from old people about a world that seemed like mythology. And into that void, something strange began to grow. Not the Christmas we know, not yet. Something quieter, stranger, more private, more fearful. By the late 17th century, Christmas in England had become a peculiar hybrid. Part religious observance, part guilty pleasure, part secret rebellion. People celebrated, yes, but carefully, quietly, behind closed doors, in whispers. Because even though the law had changed, the fear hadn't. The fear that someone was watching, that someone would report you. That celebration was still, somehow, a sin. The idea of Santa Claus, or Father Christmas, as the English called him, was barely recognizable in this period. He wasn't the jolly fat man in a red suit that Coca-Cola would later immortalize. He wasn't even particularly friendly. He was a thin, stern figure in a green robe, representing the spirit of good cheer and charity. He didn't fly through the sky on a magical sleigh pulled by reindeer. He walked, slowly, like a man carrying the weight of a culture, trying to remember how to be happy. And in some places, even that figure was banned. Not officially, not by law, but socially, symbolically, because Father Christmas represented everything the old Puritan order despised: excess, misrule, and the dangerous idea that one day a year, everyone deserved to feel wealthy. Everyone deserved to feast. Everyone deserved joy. That idea terrified the people in power. So what did they do instead? That's where this story gets weird. You're about to discover a Christmas you've never heard of. A Christmas without Santa, without reindeer, without sleighs or chimneys or the modern machinery of manufactured nostalgia. A Christmas that was boring by design, because boring was safe. Boring couldn't be banned. Boring couldn't incite riots or offend God or remind people that the world could be different. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most rebellious Christmas of all. The Christmas that survived by refusing to be noticed. The Christmas that existed in the cracks between surveillance and memory. The Christmas that said, "We will celebrate, but we will do it so quietly, so carefully, so boringly, that you won't even know we're resisting." This is the story of that Christmas. The quiet Christmas. The boring Christmas. The Christmas that was banned not by law, but by fear. And the Christmas that, in many ways, we're still living today. Because here's the secret. We never really recovered. We never fully remembered what Christmas was supposed to be. We just built a new Christmas on top of the ruins of the old one. And that new Christmas, with its sleighs and reindeer and mass-produced magic, is just another kind of performance. Another way of hiding the truth, that Christmas was always about survival. And survival is never magical. It's just necessary. If this feels too real, subscribe before it gets worse, because we're just getting started. And the next century, it only gets stranger, darker, and more uncomfortably familiar. His name was William Prynne, and he despised everything you love: music, sinful, theater, satanic, dancing, a fast track to hell. And Christmas? Christmas was the worst of all. Prynne was a lawyer, a Puritan, and a zealot. The kind of man who saw sin in a child's laughter and corruption in a loaf of sweet bread. Born in 1600, educated at Oxford, he spent his entire adult life waging war against pleasure. Any pleasure. All pleasure. In 1633, he published a book called Histriomastix, The Player's Scourge. It was over 1,000 pages long. 1,000 pages of pure, distilled rage against entertainment. In it, he railed against plays, masks, festivals, and, yes, Christmas celebrations. He called Christmas debauched revelry. He called carolers agents of the devil. He called anyone who dared to enjoy December 25th a traitor to God. The crown didn't take kindly to this. King Charles I, who quite enjoyed theatrical performances, thank you very much, saw Prynne's book as a direct attack on royal authority. Prynne was arrested, tried for seditious libel, and sentenced to life imprisonment. But that wasn't enough. They also fined him £5,000, a fortune at the time, and ordered that both his ears be cut off in a public spectacle designed to humiliate him into silence. It didn't work. They cropped his ears in the pillory at Westminster. The crowd watched as the executioner sliced through cartilage and flesh. Blood ran down Prynne's neck, staining his white collar. He didn't scream, didn't beg, just stood there, rigid with righteousness, convinced he was a martyr. And in a way, he was. Because 4 years later, he published another book. From prison. This one attacked the bishops of the Church of England. For this offense, they dragged him back to the pillory and branded his cheeks with the letters SO, seditious libeler. They also took what was left of his ears. Just stumps now. Destroyed completely. Still, he didn't stop. By 1640, England was tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war. On one side, King Charles I, his royalist supporters, and the old traditions of Merry England. The festivals, the feasts, the theater, the Christmas celebrations. On the other, Parliament, the Puritans, and men like Prin, who believed the nation's soul depended on purging every last trace of Catholic and pagan excess. Christmas was caught in the crossfire. In 1644, Parliament issued a new directive. December 25th was to be observed as a fast day, not a feast day. A fast day. A day of solemn reflection and repentance. Shops were to remain open. Markets were to operate as usual. Work was to continue. Anyone caught celebrating was guilty of defying God's will and Parliament's authority. This wasn't just a religious decree. It was a political weapon, because Christmas in the Old England had been a moment of social inversion. The lord of misrule, a peasant chosen to rule the household for a day, would sit in a master's chair, wear his clothes, give mock orders. Servants would demand gifts from their employers. The poor would go wassailing, singing outside the homes of the wealthy until they received food, drink, or money. It was ritualized rebellion, contained chaos, and the Puritans saw it for exactly what it was, a threat. So they banned it. Soldiers roamed the streets on December 25th, sniffing the air for the smell of roasting meat. They peered into windows, searching for holly, ivy, or any sign of festive decoration. They kicked down doors, dragged people from their homes, fined them, imprisoned them. In Canterbury, in 1647, a crowd of angry citizens, tired of being told they couldn't enjoy themselves, tired of having their traditions criminalized, clashed with Puritan authorities in a riot that lasted 3 days. They tore down market stalls, attacked soldiers, demanded the right to celebrate Christmas. They were crushed. By 1647, Christmas was officially abolished across England, Wales, and Scotland. No gifts, no feasting, no Father Christmas. Just work, prayer, and the gnawing sense that joy itself had become illegal. But here's the twist. Banning Christmas didn't make people less nostalgic for it. It made them more nostalgic, because nostalgia is a weapon. And in the hands of a population being told how to feel, it's a dangerous one. Royalist pamphleteers, supporters of the exiled king, furious at Parliament's overreach, began publishing underground tracts mourning the murder of Christmas. They depicted Father Christmas as an old man, thin and ragged, exiled from his homeland and starving in the wilderness. In these pamphlets, he was a refugee, a victim, a symbol of everything Parliament had destroyed. One of the most famous, published in 1652, was called The Vindication of Christmas, or his 12 years' observations upon the times. In it, Father Christmas, dressed in his traditional green robes, stands trial before Parliament. He's accused of gluttony, drunkenness, idleness, and encouraging the people to waste time on pleasure instead of piety. His defense? I came to bring good cheer, not sin, not rebellion. Just warmth in the coldest month, food for the hungry, joy for the joyless. I came because December is dark and cold and cruel, and people need something to hold on to. I am not your enemy. I am your memory. The judges don't care. He's found guilty anyway, sentenced to exile. And as he walks away, old, bent, broken, the pamphlet ends with a warning. When you kill joy, you don't kill the desire for it. You just make people desperate. And they were desperate. By 1660, when Charles II reclaimed the throne and the monarchy was restored, Christmas was no longer banned. Officially, people could celebrate again. The law said so. But something had broken. An entire generation had grown up without it. They didn't know the songs, didn't know the games, didn't know what Christmas was supposed to feel like. Their parents told them stories. Yes, but stories aren't the same as experience. And Father Christmas? He was a ghost, a memory, a symbol of something that used to exist but didn't anymore. In some parts of England, people were still afraid to celebrate. Not because of the law, because of habit, because of trauma, because the fear that soldiers might kick down their door hadn't gone away, even though the soldiers had. And in other parts, the parts where Puritans still held power, still influenced communities, Father Christmas was still banned. Not officially, but by choice. By the choice of people like Prynne, who believed that joy was a sin. And maybe he was right, not morally, but strategically, because joy is uncontrollable. Joy is unpredictable. Joy doesn't follow rules. And a society built on control can't afford that. So they killed Christmas. And when it came back different, quieter, tamer, boring. You're in a London townhouse. December 24th, 1685. The fire is lit. The curtains are drawn tight, double-checked. Because even though Christmas is legal now, even though the ban ended 25 years ago, you still feel like you're doing something wrong. And in a way, you are. Not legally wrong. Socially wrong. Because celebrating Christmas still feels like a crime, even though it isn't anymore. The law says you can feast. The law says you can decorate. The law says you're free. But the memory of soldiers kicking down doors and dragging revelers into the streets, that memory doesn't fade. It sits in your chest like a stone. It makes you whisper when you should be singing. It makes you look over your shoulder when you should be laughing. So you celebrate quietly. Your family gathers around the table. There's a small roast, nothing extravagant, nothing that would draw attention. Just a modest piece of mutton, some bread, a bit of ale. Maybe a pudding if you're feeling brave. But nothing excessive. Nothing that would make the neighbors talk. Because the neighbors are always watching. In 1685, England is still a fractured, paranoid place. The wounds of the Civil War haven't healed. Catholics are suspected of plotting to overthrow the Protestant monarchy. The Popish plot of 1678, a fabricated conspiracy that led to the execution of dozens of innocent Catholics, is still fresh in everyone's mind. Dissenters, Puritans, and other nonconformists who refuse to attend Church of England services are harassed, fined, and driven into the shadows. Trust is a luxury no one can afford. So when you celebrate Christmas, you do it behind closed doors, with people you trust, in whispers. No one sings. Not loudly, anyway. Someone hums a tune under their breath, an old carol their grandmother taught them before the ban. Something about holly and ivy. Something about the Christ child. But it's faint, hesitant, like they're afraid the walls are listening. Maybe they are. Outside, the streets are dark. No bonfires, no processions. No mummers in grotesque masks performing bawdy plays for crowds of drunken spectators. Because the Puritans may have lost political power, but they didn't lose their influence. By the 1680s, Puritanism as a political movement was dead. The Restoration had crushed it. Charles II had no interest in the joyless world his father's enemies had tried to build. He reopened the theaters. He allowed dancing. He encouraged pleasure. But culturally, Puritanism was alive and well. It had burrowed into the English psyche like a parasite. It had taught an entire generation that pleasure was suspicious, that celebration was dangerous, that joy needed to be justified, controlled, contained. And so, even though Christmas was legal, it had become something new, something private, something quiet, something almost shameful. This was the age of the quiet Christmas. No grand public displays, no roaring communal feasts, No town-wide celebrations that lasted for 12 days. Just small domestic gatherings. Families behind closed doors. Neighbors who trusted each other enough to exchange a small gift or share a drink without reporting each other to the authorities or to God. It was a rebellion, yes, but a boring one. And that's exactly what made it work. Because boring doesn't scare the authorities. Boring doesn't draw attention. Boring doesn't require soldiers or surveillance or public executions to suppress. Boring just slips under the radar and survives. But here's the strange part. Without the public spectacle, without the communal chaos, Christmas began to change at its core. It became more personal. Before the ban, Christmas had been a collective experience. The entire village celebrated together. Lords opened their great halls to peasants, providing food and drink for everyone. Servants mocked their masters in ritualized inversions of power. Strangers joined together in the streets, singing, drinking, dancing. It was loud, messy, and deeply communal. After the ban, Christmas shrank. It became about family, about home, about the small, private joys that no one could take away from you, about the relationships that mattered most, not the ones imposed by social hierarchy. And Father Christmas? He changed too. In the old days, before the ban, he was a symbol of communal festivity, a figure who moved through public spaces, blessing crowds, leading parades, presiding over feasts. He was part of the spectacle, part of the noise. But in the quiet Christmas of the 1680s, he became something else entirely. A visitor, a quiet guest who came to your home, not to the town square. He didn't arrive on a sleigh. He didn't fly through the sky. He walked through the snow, alone. An old man in a green robe, moving slowly from house to house, bringing not magic but memory. And when he knocked on your door, if he knocked at all, it was quiet, almost apologetic. This wasn't the Santa Claus of Coca-Cola ads. This wasn't the jolly, red-suited icon of consumer capitalism. This was a man, or a spirit, or an idea, who understood that joy had to be hidden to survive. Some families left out food for him. A piece of bread, a cup of ale, a slice of cheese. Not because they believed he was real. Most of them didn't, but because the ritual mattered. Because in a world that had spent decades telling them celebration was sinful, leaving out food for Father Christmas was an act of defiance. A small one, almost invisible, but defiance nonetheless. And in some places, even that was too much. Because not everyone welcomed Father Christmas back. In Puritan households, and there were still plenty of them, even in 1685, December 25th remained a day of fasting and prayer. No decorations, no gifts, no acknowledgement that this day was anything other than the birth of Christ, observed solemnly, seriously, and without joy. To them, Father Christmas wasn't a harmless tradition. He was a false idol, a distraction from the true meaning of the day, a pagan relic that had no place in a Christian home. And so, in those homes, he was banned, not by law, by choice. By the choice of parents who genuinely believed that celebrating Christmas would damn their children's souls. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That quiet, personal decision to reject Father Christmas, to refuse celebration, to insist that joy was secondary to piety, shaped Christmas more than any law ever did. Because by the end of the 17th century, Christmas had split into two. One Christmas was private, quiet, and cautious, celebrated behind closed doors by people who still remembered what it felt like to be punished for joy. The other Christmas was non-existent, erased from homes where Puritan values still held sway, where pleasure was still suspect, where the idea of a magical figure bringing gifts was seen as blasphemy, and both versions were boring. Intentionally, strategically boring. But boring it turned out, was exactly what England needed. Because after decades of civil war, after the trauma of regicide, after plague and fire and political chaos, the last thing people wanted was more upheaval. They wanted safety, predictability, a holiday that didn't demand too much of them, a holiday that wouldn't get them killed. And so Christmas became something it had never been before. Tame, domesticated, safe. And Father Christmas? He became a ghost. A memory of something that used to be loud and wild and dangerous, now reduced to a whisper. A knock on the door that no one answers. By 1700, Father Christmas was barely recognizable. He wasn't jolly. He wasn't fat. He didn't laugh, ho ho ho, or shimmy down chimneys with a sack full of toys. He was thin, tired, melancholy. He looked like a man who'd survived something, because he had. In the 18th century, as England entered the Age of Enlightenment, as reason and science began to replace superstition and tradition, Christmas continued its slow, awkward resurrection. But it wasn't a triumphant return. It was a limping, uncertain one. A resurrection without conviction. The holiday existed, yes. But it existed in fragments. In rural areas, some of the old traditions clung on like moss on a gravestone. Wassailing, the practice of singing to apple trees in the orchard to ensure a good harvest. Pouring ale on the roots, making offerings to the spirits of the land, still happened in certain villages in Somerset, Devon, Cornwall. Mumming plays, those strange, half-pagan performances where actors in grotesque masks and costumes reenacted the death and resurrection of a hero, still occurred in pockets of the countryside, though the players were often drunk and the audiences bemused. But in the cities, in London, Bristol, Bath, Manchester, Christmas was fading, not because it was banned, not because anyone was actively suppressing it, because it was boring. Without the grand public spectacles, without the communal feasts and inversions of social order, without the ritualized chaos that had made Christmas dangerous and exciting, the holiday lost its edge. It became just another day off work, if you were lucky. If you were a laborer, a servant, a factory worker in the new industrial towns springing up across England, you probably didn't get the day off at all. You went to church if your employer demanded it. You ate a slightly better meal than usual if you could afford it. Maybe you exchanged a small gift with your family, a pair of gloves, a handkerchief, a piece of ribbon. But it wasn't special. It wasn't transformative. It wasn't even particularly memorable. It was just December 25th. And Father Christmas? He was barely mentioned. In the few surviving references to him from this period, he's described as a relic. An old-fashioned symbol that people remembered their grandparents talking about, but didn't really understand anymore. Something quaint, something antiquated, something that belonged to a world that no longer existed. One writer in 1712, in a letter to The Spectator, one of the most popular periodicals of the early 18th century, described him as a ghost from a bygone age, haunting the memories of old men who still recall when December was more than just cold. Haunting. That's the perfect word for what Father Christmas had become by the early 1700s. Not a living tradition. A ghost. A shadow of something that used to be vibrant and alive, but had been drained of vitality, drained of meaning, drained of power. But here's the thing about ghosts. They don't stay dead, especially when the living start to feel nostalgic. By the mid-18th century, something strange began to happen across England and Europe. As industrialization started to take hold, as factories replaced farms, as people moved from villages to cities, as the old rhythms of rural life gave way to the mechanical grind of urban labor, nostalgia became a commodity. People who'd never experienced the old Christmas began to romanticize it. They idealized it. They mourned it. Writers, poets, and artists started publishing works that depicted Christmas as a lost golden age. A time when England was merrier, warmer, more generous, more humane. A time when lords welcomed peasants into their halls with genuine good cheer, when everyone sang together, when the world made sense, when people knew their place but also knew they were valued. It was all a lie, of course. The old Christmas they were nostalgic for had been chaotic, drunken, violent, and often dangerous. It had been banned precisely because it was uncontrollable, because it threatened social order, because it gave the poor too much power for one day. But facts don't matter when you're selling nostalgia. Nostalgia isn't about truth. It's about feeling. And by the late 1700s, people were desperate to feel something other than the cold, mechanical alienation of modern life. So they bought the fantasy. Books with titles like The Christmas We Lost and A Vindication of Old English Festivity became bestsellers. Artists painted idyllic scenes of snow-covered cottages, roaring fires. Families gathered in perfect harmony around tables groaning with food. Poets wrote about the joy and innocence of Christmas past, when the world was simpler, kinder, more magical. And Father Christmas? He was resurrected, but not as he'd been, as something new. He was no longer the stern, thin figure in green robes, representing the spirit of good cheer and charity in a harsh world. He was becoming softer, rounder, friendlier, less intimidating, more approachable. He was becoming the figure we recognize today, but he still didn't have a sleigh. That would come later. For now, in the late 18th century, Father Christmas was still walking. Still moving slowly through the snow, from house to house, carrying a staff, wearing his green robes, offering blessings and good wishes. He was a transitional figure, caught between two worlds. The old world of ritual and tradition, and the new world of commerce and sentiment. And as the 18th century gave way to the 19th, as the Industrial Revolution accelerated, as cities swelled and factories multiplied, as the gap between rich and poor widened into a chasm, Father Christmas would undergo his final transformation. He would stop being a memory and become a product. Here's a secret historians don't like to admit. Most ancient traditions are ancient at all. They're invented, usually within the last 200 years, sometimes within the last 50. Take kilts, for example. You think they're an ancient Scottish tradition, right? Worn by Highland warriors for centuries, a symbol of Celtic pride and resistance. Wrong. Kilts were invented in the 1720s by an Englishman named Thomas Rawlinson, who owned an ironworks in Scotland and wanted his workers to have more freedom of movement. He took the traditional Highland garment, a long piece of cloth called a plaid, and cut it in half. The bottom half became the kilt. It was a practical innovation, not an ancient tradition. But by the 19th century, it had been romanticized, mythologized, and turned into a symbol of Scottish identity. That's how tradition works. Someone invents it. Someone else romanticizes it. And within a generation or two, everyone believes it's always existed. Christmas is the same. The traditional Christmas tree, popularized by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in the 1840s. Before that, Christmas trees were a German custom, virtually unknown in England. The traditional Christmas card, invented in 1843 by a British civil servant named Henry Cole, who wanted a way to send holiday greetings without writing individual letters. The traditional Christmas cracker, invented in the 1840s by a London confectioner named Tom Smith, who was inspired by French bonbons wrapped in paper. Even Christmas carols, those ancient songs we assume have been sung for centuries, most of them were written in the 19th century. Silent Night, 1818. O Holy Night, 1847. Hark! The Herald Angels sing, 1739, but it didn't become popular until the 19th century. Almost everything we think of as traditional Christmas was invented during the Victorian era, including Santa's sleigh, that didn't exist until 1823. Before that, Father Christmas, or St. Nicholas, or Santa Claus, depending on where you were in Europe, traveled on foot, or on a horse, or, in some versions, on a donkey, but never in a sleigh pulled by flying reindeer. That particular piece of magic was invented by a man named Clement Clark Moore, an American professor of literature and theology who wrote a poem for his children on Christmas Eve, 1822. The poem was called A Visit from St. Nicholas. You know it better as "'Twas the night before Christmas." 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. Double quotes. In Moore's poem, Santa arrives in a miniature sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer. He names them Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donder, and Blitzen. He describes Santa as a jolly old elf with a round belly, rosy cheeks, and a white beard. He has him descend chimneys, fill stockings with toys, and fly away into the night sky. It was pure fantasy, a bedtime story for children, but it was an instant hit. The poem was published anonymously in a New York newspaper in 1823. Within a decade, it had been reprinted in dozens of newspapers and magazines across America and Europe. By the 1840s, it was one of the most famous poems in the English language. And suddenly, Santa had a sleigh. He had reindeer. He had a specific route, a specific method, a specific mythology. Before Moore's poem, the various Christmas gift-bringers of European tradition were vague, inconsistent figures. St. Nicholas was a bishop who rode a horse and was accompanied by a sinister helper who punished bad children. The Dutch Santa Claus arrived by steamboat from Spain. The British Father Christmas was a symbol of festive cheer, not a gift-giver at all. But Moore's Santa was clear, specific, visual, and artists loved him. By the 1840s and 1850s, illustrators like Thomas Nast began drawing Santa Claus based on Moore's description. Nast, a German-American cartoonist, added more details. Santa lived at the North Pole. He had a workshop. He kept lists of naughty and nice children. He read letters sent to him by children around the world. And his sleigh? It became bigger, more elaborate, piled high with toys. By the 1860s, Santa's sleigh was everywhere, in magazines, on Christmas cards, in store window displays. It had become, in just 40 years, a traditional part of Christmas. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The sleigh was never banned in 1685, because it didn't exist yet. The ban we're talking about, the reason Father Christmas couldn't fly through the sky, couldn't deliver gifts, couldn't be seen, wasn't legal. It was cultural. It was the slow, grinding erasure of joy that comes when a society decides celebration is dangerous. It was the trauma of a holiday that had been killed and resurrected over and over until no one remembered what it was supposed to be. And by the time the sleigh was invented in the 19th century, that cultural trauma was long gone. Or was it? Because even as the Victorians were inventing traditional Christmas, even as they were filling it with trees and cards and carols and sleighs, they were also anxious about it. Anxious that it was too commercial, too materialistic, too focused on gifts and not enough on meaning. Sound familiar? By the 1850s, social critics were already complaining that Christmas had become corrupt, that it was about spending money, not spreading joy, that Santa Claus was a corporate mascot, not a symbol of generosity. They were right, of course, but they were also nostalgic for a Christmas that had never existed. Just like the Victorians were nostalgic for a merry England that had never existed. Just like we're nostalgic for a traditional Christmas that was invented less than 200 years ago. Because that's what humans do. We invent traditions. We forget we invented them. And then we mourn their loss. And Santa's sleigh? Santa's magical, impossible flying sleigh? That's the perfect symbol of that process. Because it represents the moment when Christmas stopped being about survival and started being about fantasy. The moment when it stopped being real and started being performed. The moment when we decided that joy wasn't something you created, it was something you bought. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Or rather, the sleigh full of products. Because by the late 19th century, Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was an industry. And Santa Claus? He was the mascot. The brand ambassador. The most effective salesman in human history. The transformation happened fast. Faster than anyone could have predicted. In the 1860s, Christmas was still a relatively modest affair in most households. Families exchanged small, handmade gifts, knitted scarves, carved toys, homemade preserves. Churches held services. People gathered for meals. It was sweet, simple, affordable. But by the 1890s, Christmas had exploded into a commercial frenzy. Department stores in London, New York, Paris, and Berlin began decorating their windows with elaborate Christmas displays months in advance. They hired actors to dress as Santa Claus and sit in grottos, where children could sit on his lap and tell him what they wanted for Christmas. Toy companies launched massive advertising campaigns in newspapers and magazines, showing children which toys they should desire, which gifts would make them happy. Confectioners sold special Christmas candies in ornate tins. Publishers released lavish Christmas editions of books. Jewelers promoted Christmas as the perfect time to buy expensive gifts for loved ones. And all of it, every single product, every advertisement, every glittering window display featured Santa Claus. He was everywhere, on posters, on packaging, on greeting cards, in store windows, in newspaper advertisements. He wasn't a religious figure anymore. He wasn't even really a folk character. He was a brand ambassador, the ultimate salesman, and he was selling everything. By 1900, companies had figured out something profound about human psychology. Guilt is profitable. In a world where wealth was increasingly concentrated in the hands of the few, where factories ground workers into exhaustion for pennies a day, where poverty was visible on every street corner, the middle and upper classes needed a way to feel good about themselves. They needed to believe they were generous, charitable, good people. And what better way to prove your goodness than by buying gifts? Not for yourself. That would be selfish. For others, for your children, for your family. Because Santa Claus, that jolly, benevolent figure who rewarded good children with toys and punished bad children with coal, gave you moral permission to spend money and call it love. He turned consumption into virtue. He transformed shopping into an act of care. And the sleigh? The sleigh was essential to this transformation because the sleigh represented abundance. It was piled high with toys, overflowing, endless. It told you that there was enough for everyone. That scarcity was a lie. That as long as you believed, as long as you were good, as long as you worked hard and spent your money wisely, you would receive. It was the perfect capitalist fantasy. And it sold everything. Toys, of course. That was the obvious market. By the 1890s, toy manufacturers were producing elaborate, expensive toys specifically marketed as Christmas gifts. Rocking horses, dollhouses, tin soldiers, mechanical trains. Things that would have been unimaginable luxuries just a generation earlier were now presented as necessities. If you loved your children, you bought them toys for Christmas. If you didn't, you were a bad parent. That was the message. Subtle, insidious, effective. But it wasn't just toys. Christmas became the season for selling everything. Jewelry companies told men that if they loved their wives, they'd buy them diamond bracelets for Christmas. Clothing stores told women that if they wanted to look respectable at Christmas parties, they needed new dresses. Food companies sold special Christmas delicacies, imported oranges, exotic nuts, expensive chocolates. Alcohol companies pushed champagne, port, and whiskey as essential Christmas beverages. Even churches got in on it, publishing special Christmas hymnals and devotional books. By 1910, Christmas accounted for more than a quarter of annual retail sales in the United States and Britain. It still does. Christmas is the most profitable season of the year for retailers. Always has been. Always will be. And Santa Claus, invented by a poem, popularized by advertisers, and cemented by Coca-Cola in the 1930s, became the most recognizable figure in the world. More recognizable than Jesus Christ, whose birth the holiday supposedly celebrates. More recognizable than any political leader, any historical figure, any religious icon. Because Santa Claus wasn't a person. He was an idea. The idea that if you work hard, if you're good, if you believe, you'll be rewarded. It's the same idea that powers capitalism. The same idea that tells workers if they just work harder, they'll get promoted. The same idea that tells the poor if they just try harder, they'll become rich. The same idea that blames failure on moral deficiency rather than systemic inequality. And it's a lie. Because the children who got the most gifts on Christmas morning weren't the ones who'd been the best. They were the ones whose parents had the most money. And the children who got nothing, they'd been just as good, just as deserving. They just didn't have anyone filling a sleigh for them. But admitting that Christmas was a system rigged by wealth, that Santa's naughty and nice list was actually just an economic hierarchy disguised as moral judgment, would ruin the magic, would expose the lie at the heart of the holiday. So instead, we told stories. Stories about naughty and nice lists. Stories about Santa watching and judging every action. Stories that made poverty seem like a moral failing rather than an economic reality. And those stories worked. Because people wanted to believe them. Rich people wanted to believe their wealth was deserved, that their children got more presents because they were better, not because they had more money. Poor people wanted to believe that if they just tried harder, if they raised their children better, if they were good enough, they'd be rewarded too. Everyone wanted to believe the system was fair, that goodness mattered, that somewhere, someone was keeping score, even if their own lives suggested otherwise. By the early 20th century, Christmas had become what it is today, a cultural juggernaut, a holiday that demands participation, a holiday that measures love in gifts, in spending, in performance, a holiday that makes you feel like a failure if you can't afford to keep up with the fantasy. And Santa Claus? He's the enforcer. The one who reminds you that if you don't give enough, don't spend enough, don't perform Christmas correctly, you're failing. You're on the naughty list. And the sleigh? The sleigh full of toys, flying through the impossible night sky, perfect and abundant and magical? That's the promise. The promise that if you just try hard enough, if you just believe hard enough, if you just spend enough money, Christmas will finally feel the way it's supposed to. Magical, perfect, worth it. But here's the secret nobody tells you. It never does. Because magic isn't real. And no amount of spending, no amount of believing, no amount of performing can create something that doesn't exist. Christmas was never supposed to be perfect. It was never supposed to be magical. It was supposed to be human, messy, imperfect, real, a moment of warmth in the cold, a moment of connection in the dark, a moment of survival disguised as celebration. But we forgot that. We traded survival for spectacle. We traded connection for consumption. We traded reality for fantasy. And now we're stuck with a holiday that exhausts us, disappoints us, and makes us feel inadequate. Because we're trying to live up to an invention, a fantasy created by poets, artists, and advertisers over the course of 200 years. A fantasy that has nothing to do with why Christmas exists in the first place. And maybe that's the real reason Santa's sleigh was banned. Not by Puritans in 1685, but by reality itself. By the impossible weight of expectation. By the realization that no sleigh can carry the burden we've placed on it. That no amount of magic can fix what's broken. That Christmas, like everything else, is just what we make it. And right now, we're making it wrong. Here's the truth you won't find in any Victorian Christmas card, in any Coca-Cola advertisement, in any mall Santa's grotto. Santa's sleigh wasn't banned in 1685. It was banned by reality. Because for most of human history, Christmas wasn't about magic. It was about survival. Let's go back to basics. Let's remember what December actually is. December is the coldest, darkest month of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. Before central heating, before electric lights, before global supply chains and refrigeration and industrial food production, winter was a death sentence for millions. People starved. People froze. People died. That's not poetic language. That's historical fact. In medieval England, up to 10% of the population died every winter. Mostly the very young and the very old. Mostly the poor. If you survived winter, you were lucky. If your children survived winter, you were blessed. And Christmas, the Feast of the Nativity, celebrated on December 25th, was a brief, desperate attempt to create warmth and light in the middle of that darkness. It wasn't about presents. It wasn't about flying reindeer. It wasn't about a jolly fat man rewarding good children. It was about slaughtering your livestock before they starved to death because there wasn't enough fodder to keep them alive through winter. It was about brewing the last of your ale and sharing it with your neighbors before it went bad because you had no way to preserve it. It was about gathering around a fire and telling stories because entertainment was free and warmth was communal, and if you were going to die in the cold and dark, at least you wouldn't die alone. Christmas was practical. Brutally, desperately practical. And the traditions that survived, the ones that eventually became Christmas magic, were survival strategies dressed up as celebration. Evergreen decorations? Holly, ivy, mistletoe? Those weren't just pretty. They were a reminder that some things stay alive even in winter. That life continues, that spring will come again. Candles and fires? Light and heat when both were scarce and precious. Feasting? Using up perishable food before it rotted. Slaughtering animals you couldn't feed. Eating everything you had because there was no point saving it. You'd be dead before you could eat it later. Even gift-giving had a practical origin rooted in survival and social control. In medieval England, lords were expected to give gifts to their servants on Christmas. Not because they were generous, because it was a form of social insurance. If you didn't give, if you didn't share your wealth during the darkest time of year, your servants might revolt, might kill you, might burn down your manor house while you slept. The gift was protection, a bribe, a way of saying, I see you, I value you, don't murder me. So when we talk about banning Christmas, we're not just talking about banning a holiday. We're talking about banning the survival strategies that got people through winter. And that's exactly what the Puritans did. By outlawing Christmas in 1644, they weren't just attacking Catholicism or paganism or social disorder. They were attacking the social safety net. They were saying, you don't deserve a day off. You don't deserve a feast. You don't deserve warmth or community or joy. You deserve to work. And if you die, that's God's will. The Puritan work ethic, The idea that labor is virtuous, that idleness is sinful, that suffering is redemptive, required the elimination of holidays. Because holidays reminded people that life didn't have to be endless work, that rest was possible, that joy was possible, that another world was possible. And the ruling class couldn't allow that, so they killed Christmas. And in the process, they made winter even colder, even darker, even deadlier. But here's where the story gets strange. Because after the ban was lifted, after Christmas was allowed again, it didn't come back the same way. People remembered the feasting. They remembered the decorations. They remembered the rituals, but they forgot why those rituals existed. They forgot that Christmas wasn't magic, it was survival. And so, when they tried to resurrect Christmas in the late 17th and 18th centuries, they resurrected it as performance, as theater, as something you did rather than something you needed. And that's when Father Christmas stopped being a symbol of communal survival and started becoming a fantasy, a character, a story, a lie. Because once Christmas became performance, it needed spectacle. It needed to be bigger, brighter, more impossible than real life. And a man walking through the snow, delivering bread and ale to poor families, helping them survive the winter, that wasn't magical. That was just charity. And charity is boring. Charity doesn't sell products. Charity doesn't generate profit. Charity doesn't make you feel special. But a man flying through the sky in a sleigh pulled by magical reindeer, delivering toys to every good child in the world in one impossible night, that's a miracle. That's a story. That's something worth believing in, even if it's not real. Especially if it's not real. Because by the 19th century, when the modern image of Santa and his sleigh was being invented, people didn't want reality. They wanted escape. They wanted to believe in a version of Christmas where no one was cold, no one was hungry, where every child received exactly what they deserved, where goodness was always rewarded and badness was always punished. They wanted a just world. And since the real world wasn't just, they invented one. They invented Santa Claus, not as a person, as an idea. The idea that goodness is rewarded, that generosity exists, that somewhere someone is watching and keeping score, that the universe is moral. And the sleigh? The sleigh was proof. Proof that impossible things can happen. Proof that magic exists. Proof that maybe, just maybe, the world is kinder than it seems. But here's the thing about inventing magic. It makes reality unbearable. Because once you've been told that Christmas is supposed to be a miracle, anything less than a miracle feels like failure. And most Christmases aren't miracles. They're just days. Cold, quiet, ordinary days. Days when you're tired. Days when you're broke. Days when your family fights. Days when the people you love are far away or dead or too complicated to love easily. Days when the sleigh doesn't come. And maybe that's the real ban. Not the one imposed by Parliament in 1644. Not the one enforced by Puritan soldiers who kicked down doors and arrested people for singing carols. But the one we impose on ourselves every year. When we decide that Christmas has to be perfect. That it has to be magical. That it has to look like the fantasy. That anything less than the sleigh, the reindeer, the impossible abundance, the manufactured joy, is disappointment, is failure, is proof that we're not good enough. And in doing so, we ban the one thing Christmas was always supposed to be: real, human, a survival strategy for getting through the darkest, coldest time of year. Not by pretending the dark isn't there, but by lighting a candle anyway. Not by expecting magic, but by creating warmth. Not by waiting for a sleigh to arrive, but by sharing what we have with the people around us. That's the Christmas that was banned in 1685. Not by law, but by forgetting. And it's the Christmas we're still trying to remember. You're lying in bed, December 24th, 2024. The tree is up. The lights are glowing softly in the living room. The presents are wrapped, stacked neatly under synthetic branches. Everything looks perfect. Instagram perfect. Pinterest perfect. Hallmark movie perfect. Except you. You're lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering why you feel so empty. You spent weeks preparing for this. Weeks shopping, wrapping, decorating, planning. You maxed out your credit card buying gifts for people who probably don't need them. You argued with your partner about whose family to visit. You smiled through stress and exhaustion and called it holiday spirit. And now, on Christmas Eve, alone in the dark, you realize something. You don't feel joyful. You feel tired. Tired of performing. Tired of pretending. Tired of trying to manufacture magic from a checklist of obligations. You're not alone. This is the modern Christmas crisis. The realization that the holiday we've been sold, the one with the sleigh, the reindeer, the perfect family gathering, the abundance, the joy, the magic, doesn't exist. And it never did. What exists instead is obligation. The obligation to perform happiness. To create magic for others. To live up to a fantasy invented by poets, artists, and advertisers over the course of 200 years. And here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to say out loud. That fantasy is killing Christmas. Because when you're told that Christmas is supposed to be perfect, anything less than perfect feels like failure. When you're told that Christmas is about family, but your family is dysfunctional, distant, or dead, the holiday becomes a wound that reopens every year. When you're told that Christmas is about giving, but you can't afford to give, the holiday becomes a humiliation, a reminder of everything you lack. When you're told that Christmas is magical, but your life is hard and cold and exhausting, the holiday becomes a lie, a performance you can't maintain. So what do? You retreat. You go through the motions. You decorate because you're supposed to. You shop because everyone else is shopping. You smile because smiling is expected. But inside, you're numb. You're performing a ritual you don't believe in, hoping that if you do it correctly, if you follow all the rules, if you spend enough money and put in enough effort, the magic will appear. It doesn't. Because magic isn't something you can manufacture. It's not something you can buy. And it's definitely not something you can force. This is the legacy of the quiet Christmas. The Christmas of 1685, where joy was banned and celebration was dangerous. Where people gathered in whispers behind closed doors. Where Father Christmas became a ghost. We think we've moved past it. We think we've reclaimed Christmas, filled it with light and noise and abundance and spectacle. But we haven't. We've just replaced one form of repression with another. Instead of Puritans telling us Christmas is sinful, we have capitalism telling us Christmas isn't good enough unless we spend more, do more, be more. Instead of soldiers kicking down doors, we have social media showing us everyone else's perfect Christmas, making our own feel inadequate. Instead of fear of punishment, we have guilt for not measuring up. And the result is the same. A Christmas that feels hollow. A Christmas where the sleigh is full but your heart is empty. A Christmas that exhausts you instead of restoring you, because we're still living in the shadow of that ban. Still afraid to celebrate incorrectly. Still trying to prove we're good enough. Still waiting for permission to enjoy ourselves. And maybe that's the real story. Not that Santa's sleigh was banned in 1685, but that we never really brought it back. We created an image of it, a fantasy, an advertisement. But the real thing, the real spirit of Christmas, whatever that was, got lost somewhere between the ban and the resurrection. And now we're left with a holiday that nobody actually enjoys. We endure it. We survive it. We perform it. but we don't feel it. Not the way we're supposed to. Not the way the fantasy promises. So every year, on Christmas Eve, millions of people lie in the dark, just like you, wondering why it doesn't feel right. Why the magic never comes. Why the sleigh never arrives. And the answer is simple, even if it's painful. Because we're waiting for the wrong thing. We're waiting for a miracle. For magic. For something external to fix what's broken inside us. We're waiting for Santa Claus. But Santa Claus isn't coming. He never was. Because Santa Claus is us. We're the ones who have to create the magic. We're the ones who have to decide what Christmas means. We're the ones who have to light the candle in the dark. Not because we're supposed to. Not because it's tradition, but because we need to. Because December is still cold. Life is still hard. Winter still kills. And Christmas, the real Christmas, beneath all the fantasy and performance, was always just a survival strategy. A way of saying the world is dark, but we're still here. A way of saying we have so little, but we'll share it anyway. A way of saying we might not make it through this, but at least we won't go through it alone. That's the Christmas that was banned in 1685. And that's the Christmas we need to bring back. Not the sleigh. Not the reindeer. Not the perfect, impossible fantasy. Just the simple, human act of choosing warmth over coldness. Connection over isolation. Reality over performance. That's the boring Christmas. The quiet Christmas. The Christmas nobody sells you because there's no profit in it. But it's the only Christmas that actually works. The only one that actually matters. The only one that might actually feel like something real. So here's the question we've been dancing around for 8 blocks. If Santa's sleigh was banned culturally, symbolically, practically, what did people actually do instead? What does Christmas look like when you strip away all the fantasy? Let me take you back to England, December 25th, 1685. You wake up early, not because you're excited, because it's cold and sleeping is uncomfortable. You get dressed in the dark. Same clothes you wore yesterday. Same clothes you'll wear tomorrow. You go downstairs. Your family is already awake. Your mother is preparing breakfast. Bread, a bit of cheese if you're lucky, some ale. No one mentions that it's Christmas, because mentioning it still feels dangerous, even though it's legal now. Instead, you eat in silence. Then your father says, we should go to church. Not because he's particularly religious, because that's what you do. Because going to church is expected. Because not going would make the neighbors talk. So you walk through the cold streets to the parish church. It's not decorated. No evergreen boughs. No candles except the usual ones. No special music. The service is short. The vicar reads the nativity story from Luke. There's a brief sermon about humility and gratitude. Then you're dismissed. You walk home, and that's it. That's Christmas. No gifts. No feast. No Father Christmas. No magic. Just a normal day with a brief acknowledgement that something significant happened 1,600 years ago in a place you'll never see. You spend the afternoon working, chopping wood, maybe, mending clothes, doing the things you do every other day. In the evening, your family gathers around the fire. If you're moderately prosperous, there might be a slightly better meal than usual. A bit of meat, some vegetables, a pudding, but nothing extravagant. Nothing that would make the neighbors jealous or suspicious. Someone might tell a story, an old folk tale, something about winter or survival or trickster figures who helped the poor. But no one mentions Father Christmas, because Father Christmas is still a ghost, still a memory, still something people aren't quite sure they're allowed to believe in. And then you go to bed. That's the quiet Christmas. The boring Christmas. The Christmas that existed in the space between ban and resurrection, between fear and freedom, between survival and celebration. It wasn't magical. It wasn't special. It wasn't even particularly memorable. But it was real. And for some people, the people who couldn't afford spectacle, who didn't have the energy for performance, who just needed to get through winter without dying, it was enough. Because here's the secret about boring Christmases. They don't demand anything from you. They don't require you to perform joy you don't feel. They don't make you compete with your neighbors. They don't leave you feeling inadequate because you couldn't live up to the fantasy. They just are. A day. Like any other day. Except maybe you're a little kinder. A little more generous. A little more aware that you're not alone in the cold and dark. That's what people did instead of the sleigh. Instead of magic, they chose reality. Instead of spectacle, they chose simplicity. Instead of performance, they chose presence. And maybe that's the lesson we need to relearn. Because 340 years later, we're still struggling with the same problem. We've built Christmas into something so elaborate, so expensive, so demanding that it's become unbearable. We've created a holiday that requires weeks of preparation, thousands of dollars of spending, and constant performance of joy. And then we wonder why we're exhausted, why it doesn't feel meaningful, why the magic never comes. Maybe it's because we're trying too hard. Maybe it's because we've forgotten that Christmas was never supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be human, messy, imperfect, small, a quiet moment of connection in the middle of winter. Not a production, not a performance, not a competition, just a day. A day when you choose warmth. A day when you share what little you have. A day when you acknowledge that life is hard and we're all just trying to survive it together. That's the Christmas that was banned in 1685, not by Puritans, but by expectation. And it's the Christmas we could bring back, if we're brave enough to be boring, if we're willing to let go of the fantasy, if we can accept that the sleigh isn't coming. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need a sleigh. Maybe we never did. Let's talk about what you're really afraid of. It's not that Christmas won't be magical. It's that Christmas will reveal the truth that you're not enough. That no matter how much you spend, how hard you try, how perfectly you perform, you can't create the feeling you're supposed to have. The feeling the commercials promise. The feeling the songs describe. The feeling everyone else seems to experience effortlessly. That warm, golden, perfect feeling of Christmas magic. You've been chasing it your entire life. As a child, you believed in it. You believed in Santa, in the sleigh, in the reindeer. You believed that if you were good enough, if you waited patiently enough, magic would happen. Sometimes it did. Sometimes Christmas morning felt miraculous. Sometimes the gifts under the tree, the smell of cinnamon and pine, the lights twinkling in the dark, all combined into something that felt like proof that the world was good. But other times it felt hollow. The presents weren't quite right. The family gathering was tense. Someone got drunk and started an argument. Someone else cried. The magic didn't appear. And you blamed yourself. You thought maybe you hadn't been good enough. Maybe you hadn't believed hard enough. Maybe you had done something wrong. As you got older, the responsibility shifted. Now you weren't waiting for magic. You were supposed to create it. For your children, for your partner, for your parents, for everyone around you. You were supposed to be Santa Claus, and the pressure is crushing. Because you can't control magic. You can't manufacture it. You can't force other people to feel something they don't feel. But you try anyway. You spend money you don't have. You work yourself to exhaustion. You smile through stress. You pretend everything is perfect. Because if you don't, if you let the mask slip, if you admit that Christmas is hard and you're tired and the magic isn't happening, then you've failed. You're on the naughty list. You're the Grinch, the Scrooge, The person who ruined Christmas. This is the ghost you carry. The ghost of every Christmas that didn't live up to the fantasy. The ghost of every time you tried and failed to create magic. The ghost of every moment when you felt inadequate, broken, wrong. And that ghost? That ghost was created in 1685. Not literally, but symbolically. Because 1685 was the moment when Christmas became something you could fail at. Before the ban, Christmas was communal. It was something that happened to you, not something you created. The Lord provided the feast. The community provided the entertainment. The church provided the meaning. You just showed up. But after the ban, after Christmas became private, domestic, individual, it became your responsibility. If Christmas didn't happen, it was because you didn't make it happen. If Christmas wasn't magical, it was because you weren't good enough. And that burden, that crushing, impossible burden, has been passed down through generations. Your great dash, great dash, great dash. Grandparents felt it in 1685, whispering carols behind closed doors, terrified they were doing something wrong. Your great-grandparents felt it in the Victorian era, trying to live up to Dickens's fantasy of perfect Christmas cheer. Your grandparents felt it in the 1950s, trying to create the suburban Christmas dream of abundance and normalcy. Your parents felt it in the 1980s and 90s, bankrupting themselves to buy you the toys advertised on TV. And now you feel it. The ghost of Christmas inadequacy. The feeling that no matter what you do, it's never enough. And here's the truth nobody wants to admit. It's not your fault. You didn't fail Christmas. Christmas failed you. The fantasy failed you. The lie that Christmas should be magical, that it should be perfect, that it should fix everything wrong in your life. That lie failed you. Because Christmas can't be those things. It's just a day. A cold day in December. And putting that much pressure on a single day is insane. But we do it anyway, every year, because we're desperate. Desperate for meaning. Desperate for connection. Desperate for proof that life is more than just grinding through days of work and sleep and survival. Desperate for magic. And Christmas promises magic. The sleigh promises magic. Santa promises magic. But magic isn't real. And no amount of spending, decorating, performing, or believing can change that. So what do? You let go. You let go of the fantasy. You let go of the expectation. You let go of the ghost. You stop trying to create magic and start trying to create moments. Small moments, real moments, human moments. A conversation with someone you love. A shared meal. A warm drink on a cold night. A moment of laughter. A moment of silence. Not magic. Just life. Just connection. Just the simple acknowledgement that you're here. They're here. And for this moment, that's enough. That's the Christmas that was banned in 1685. Not the spectacle. Not the fantasy. Not the sleigh. Just the human act of being present with other humans in the middle of winter. And that's the Christmas you can have. If you're brave enough to stop performing. If you're willing to be boring. If you can forgive yourself for not being Santa Claus. Because you're not Santa Claus. You never were. And that's okay. You're just human. And Christmas, the real Christmas, beneath all the performance and fantasy, was always just for humans. Flawed, tired, imperfect humans. Trying to survive winter. Together. There's a strange movement happening right now. Quietly. Almost invisibly. People are opting out. Not of Christmas entirely, but of the performance. The spectacle. The exhausting machinery of modern Christmas. They're not posting about it on social media. They're not making it a statement. They're just stopping. Stopping the frantic shopping. Stopping the elaborate decorating. stopping the forced gatherings with people they don't actually like, stopping the performance of joy they don't feel. They're creating something new, or rather something old. They're creating quiet Christmases, small gatherings, simple meals, homemade gifts or no gifts at all, conversations instead of spectacles, presents instead of presents. They're rediscovering what people in 1685 already knew, that Christmas doesn't have to be loud to be meaningful, that celebration doesn't have to be expensive to be real, that joy doesn't have to be performed to exist. And they're doing it because they're exhausted. Exhausted by the relentless demand to make Christmas perfect. Exhausted by the financial pressure. Exhausted by the emotional labor of managing everyone else's expectations and disappointments. They're opting for boring. And discovering that boring is actually kind of beautiful. Because when you strip away all the noise, all the expectation, all the performance, what's left is surprisingly satisfying. Connection, warmth, rest. The things Christmas was actually supposed to provide before it became an industry. This isn't a revolution. It's not organized. It's not trendy. It's just people, individually, quietly, deciding they've had enough. Enough of the sleigh that never comes. Enough of the magic that never arrives. Enough of the fantasy that leaves them feeling inadequate. They're choosing reality instead. And reality, it turns out, is enough. A friend of mine told me about their Christmas last year. No tree, no decorations, no gifts. Just them, their partner, and a pot of soup. They spent the day reading, talking, watching old movies. They went for a walk in the cold. They lit candles as the sun went down. It was, they said, the best Christmas they'd ever had. Because it didn't demand anything from them. It didn't require performance or perfection. It just was. Another friend canceled their family gathering, not out of anger, just out of honesty. They sent a message. I love you all, but the big family Christmas is too much for me this year. I need quiet. I need rest. I'll see you in January. And instead of outrage, they got understanding. Relief, even. Because half the family had been feeling the same way, but were too afraid to say it. This is how traditions change. Not through grand declarations or organized movements, but through small individual acts of honesty. Through people saying, this doesn't work for me anymore. Through people choosing their own well-being over other people's expectations. Through people rediscovering that Christmas is supposed to serve them, not the other way around. And maybe that's the real lesson of the 1685 ban. Not that Christmas should be loud and public and communal, but that Christmas should be whatever you need it to be. For the people in 1685, living in the shadow of trauma and fear, Christmas needed to be quiet, private, safe. For the Victorians, desperate for meaning in an industrializing world, Christmas needed to be sentimental, abundant, magical. For us, exhausted by performance and overwhelmed by expectation, maybe Christmas needs to be small again, quiet again, boring again. Because boring isn't actually boring. Boring is sustainable. Boring is honest. Boring is the antidote to exhaustion. When you stop trying to create magic, you create space for something better. Authenticity. When you stop performing joy, you create space for actual contentment. When you stop comparing your Christmas to everyone else's fantasy Christmas, you create space for your own experience to matter. And that experience doesn't have to include a sleigh. It doesn't have to include reindeer or elaborate gifts or perfect family harmony or any of the things we've been told are essential to a real Christmas. It just has to include what you actually need. Maybe that's rest. Maybe that's solitude. Maybe that's one meaningful conversation. Maybe that's permission to feel however you actually feel instead of how you're supposed to feel. Maybe it's soup and candles and silence. Maybe it's enough. The quiet Christmas isn't a rejection of joy. It's a rejection of the idea that joy has to look a certain way. It's a rejection of the fantasy that's been choking the life out of the holiday for 200 years. It's a return to the truth that people in 1685 understood instinctively. That survival is more important than spectacle. That connection is more valuable than consumption. That being present with the people you love, or being peacefully alone if that's what you need, is worth more than any gift wrapped in shiny paper. This doesn't mean Christmas has to be sad or depressing or joyless. It just means it gets to be real. Real is messy. Real is imperfect. Real doesn't photograph well for Instagram. But real is the only thing that actually nourishes you. The only thing that actually fills the emptiness instead of just covering it with glitter. And maybe that's why the quiet Christmas is coming back. Not because people don't want joy, but because they're tired of pretending. Tired of performing a holiday they don't believe in. Tired of believing. Tired of bankrupting themselves for a fantasy that never materializes. They want something real, something human, something that doesn't require a sleigh to matter. And they're discovering that when you let go of the fantasy, when you stop waiting for magic to arrive from outside, when you stop trying to be Santa Claus for everyone around you, something unexpected happens. You find the thing you were looking for all along. Not magic. Something better. Peace. Not the fake peace of a perfect Christmas card, but the real peace of accepting that you're enough. Your life is enough. Your small, quiet, imperfect Christmas is enough. That's the Christmas that was banned in 1685. And that's the Christmas that's finally, slowly, quietly coming back. Not in department stores or television specials or viral social media posts, but in living rooms and kitchens and small apartments where people have decided that this year they're done performing. This year, they're just going to be. And maybe, just maybe, that will feel more like Christmas than anything else ever has. But let's be honest about why the quiet Christmas is so hard to achieve. Because there's an entire industry built on stopping you. An industry worth billions of dollars. An industry that needs you to feel inadequate, so you'll keep spending. An industry that profits from your longing, your guilt, your desperate desire to create magic. The Christmas industry doesn't sell products. It sells the promise of transformation. It tells you that if you just buy the right gifts, your family will be grateful and happy. That if you just decorate beautifully enough, your home will feel magical. That if you just create the perfect Christmas dinner, everyone will remember this as the best Christmas ever. It sells you the fantasy that consumption equals love. That spending equals caring. That the more money you pour into Christmas, the more meaningful it becomes. And when you inevitably discover that's not true, when the gifts don't create gratitude, when the decorations don't create magic, when the perfect dinner is consumed in 20 minutes and forgotten by January, the industry has an answer for that too. You didn't do it right. You didn't spend enough. You didn't try hard enough. Next year, you'll need to do more. This is the genius of modern Christmas capitalism. It's built on a promise that can never be fulfilled. Because the thing you're actually longing for, connection, meaning, love, peace, can't be purchased. But the industry will never tell you that. Instead, it shows you advertisements of perfect families gathered around perfect trees, opening perfect gifts with perfect smiles. It shows you influencers with perfectly decorated homes, perfectly styled children, perfectly curated Christmas moments. It shows you a fantasy and tells you it's achievable. All you need is this product, this decoration, this experience. And when that doesn't work, you need the next product, the next decoration, the next experience. It's an endless cycle of manufactured inadequacy. The average American spends over $1,000 on Christmas. The average British person spends over £500. And what do they get for that money? Mostly regret. credit card debt that takes months to pay off, gifts that are used once or never, decorations that go back in boxes, food that's eaten and forgotten. The happiness, if it comes at all, is fleeting. But the debt is real. The exhaustion is real. The sense of having been tricked is real. Yet the next year, we do it again. Because the industry is very, very good at what it does. It understands something fundamental about human psychology. We're desperate for transformation. Desperate to believe that this year will be different. That this Christmas will finally be the magical one. That this time, the promise will come true. And that desperation makes us vulnerable. Vulnerable to manipulation. Vulnerable to guilt. Vulnerable to the endless message that we're not doing enough, not giving enough, not being enough. The industry knows that Christmas is one of the few times of year when people give themselves permission to spend money they don't have. When going into debt feels justified because it's for the children, or for family, or for Christmas. When fiscal responsibility seems less important than creating magic. And it exploits that mercilessly. Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas sales that start in October, limited edition products, exclusive experiences, all designed to create urgency, scarcity, fear of missing out, all designed to make you spend before you have time to think about whether you actually want or need what you're buying. And here's the most insidious part. The industry has successfully convinced us that opting out makes us bad people. That a simple Christmas means you don't love your family enough. That not buying gifts means you're selfish. That choosing rest over performance means you're lazy. It's moralized consumption. Turn spending into virtue and thrift into vice. This is why the quiet Christmas is an act of rebellion. Not because it rejects joy or connection or celebration, but because it rejects the industry. It says, I don't need your products to love my family. I don't need your decorations to feel Christmas. I don't need your fantasy because I'm choosing reality. And the industry hates that. Because if enough people opt out, if enough people choose quiet over spectacle, simple over elaborate, real over performed, the entire economic structure of modern Christmas collapses. Billions of dollars disappear. An entire season of profit evaporates. And that's why you'll never see a Christmas advertisement that says, this Christmas, do less, buy less, be less. Why you'll never see a commercial that shows a family sitting around a table with simple food and homemade gifts, looking genuinely content. Why you'll never see a campaign that tells you you're already enough, that your Christmas is already enough, that you don't need anything more. Because that message, while true, isn't profitable. The industry needs your inadequacy. It needs your guilt. It needs your desperate, exhausting attempt to create magic through consumption. Without that, it dies. And maybe that's the real reason Santa's sleigh was banned, not in 1685, but now. In the sense that the simple, authentic Christmas, the Christmas of human connection and shared survival, has been banned by an industry that needs you to believe that's not enough. That quiet is failure. That simple is sad. That boring means you don't care. But what if the opposite is true? What if choosing simple means you care enough to resist manipulation? What if choosing quiet means you value real connection over performed joy? What if choosing boring means you're brave enough to reject the fantasy and live in reality? That's the Christmas the industry doesn't want you to have. Because that Christmas is free. It doesn't require their products, their promises, their endless cycle of spend and regret. It just requires honesty. The honesty to admit that the sleigh isn't coming. That magic isn't real. That love can't be purchased. And that maybe, just maybe, that's okay. Let's talk about the hardest part. The children. Because everything I've said so far might seem reasonable, even liberating, for adults. But what about the kids? Don't they deserve magic? Don't they deserve to believe in Santa, in flying reindeer, in the impossible joy of Christmas morning? Isn't childhood the one time when fantasy should be protected? This is the argument that stops most people from opting out of the Christmas performance. Not for themselves, for their children. They'll bankrupt themselves, exhaust themselves, stress themselves into illness, all because they believe their children need the fantasy, need the magic, need the lie. And it is a lie. We tell children that a magical man watches them constantly, judging whether they're naughty or nice. We tell them this man breaks into their house through the chimney while they sleep. We tell them he knows what they want, rewards them if they're good, punishes them if they're bad. We tell them this man defies the laws of physics, traveling around the entire world in one night, delivering presents to every good child. And we tell them this is real. Then, around age 7 or 8, we expect them to figure out we've been lying to them all along. And we act surprised when some children feel betrayed. When the discovery that Santa isn't real becomes the moment they stop trusting adults completely. When they realize that the people they love most in the world looked them in the eye and told them elaborate lies. For years, every December. Now, I'm not saying Santa is child abuse. I'm not saying telling your kids about Santa makes you a bad parent, but I'm saying we should think about why we do it. Why we're so invested in this particular fantasy. Why we feel like childhood can't be magical without it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Santa Claus isn't for children. He's for adults. He's for adults who want to feel like they're creating magic. He's for adults who are nostalgic for their own childhoods, who want to recreate the feeling they remember having. He's for adults who've bought into the idea that childhood should be a time of pure, innocent belief, untainted by reality. But children don't need Santa to experience wonder. Children are capable of experiencing wonder at real things. At snow falling, at lights twinkling, at the taste of hot chocolate, at stories told by the fire. They don't need to be lied to in order to feel joy. In fact, there's an argument that the Santa lie actually diminishes wonder. Because it teaches children that magic is external, that it comes from a distant figure who judges them, that it's conditional on their behavior, that it's something they receive passively, not something they create or participate in. What if instead we taught them that the magic of Christmas is something humans create for each other? That when someone gives you a gift, it's because they thought of you, cared about you, wanted to bring you joy, not because you were on a list, not because you earned it, not because a mythical figure decided you deserved it, but because love is real and humans are capable of generosity. Isn't that actually more magical? More meaningful? More true? What if we told children, Christmas is a time when we choose to be extra kind, extra generous, extra thoughtful. We give gifts to show people we love them. We gather together because connection matters. We light candles because the world is dark and we choose to create light. That's not less magical than Santa. It's more magical because it's real. And it teaches children something Santa never can. That they have the power to create magic themselves. That they're not passive recipients waiting for an external force to reward them. That they're active participants in creating joy, warmth, and connection. There are cultures that celebrate winter holidays without Santa. There are families that have opted out of the Santa narrative entirely and report that their children's Christmases are just as joyful, just as anticipated, just as memorable. Maybe more so, because the joy isn't based on a lie that will eventually be exposed. The joy is based on real human connection, real generosity, real love. And here's what I think we're really afraid of when we consider ditching Santa. We're afraid our children will realize how ordinary we are, how limited our power is, how we can actually make magic happen. Santa allows us to take credit for generosity while avoiding the vulnerability of owning it. We can give our children gifts and say, Santa brought this, instead of, I chose this for you because I love you. We can create a special Christmas and say, Santa made it magical, instead of, I worked hard to create this moment for you. Santa is a shield, a way of avoiding the intimacy of direct love. And maybe that's what we actually need to let go of. Not the joy, not the celebration, not the giving, but the shield, the distance, the fantasy that allows us to love indirectly instead of directly. What if this Christmas you told your children the truth, not cruelly, not dismissively, but honestly? There's no magical man who judges whether you're naughty or nice, but I love you. And because I love you, I want to give you gifts. I want to make this time special. Not because you earned it, but because you exist. Because you're you. Because that's what love is. Isn't that better? Isn't that the Christmas that was banned in 1685 trying to come back? The Christmas where humans are enough. Where our love for each other is enough. Where reality is enough. You don't need a sleigh to love your children. You never did. Here's what you need to hear. You have permission to do Christmas differently. You have permission to opt out of the parts that exhaust you. You have permission to say no to gatherings that drain you. You have permission to not buy gifts you can't afford. You have permission to not decorate if you don't want to. You have permission to spend Christmas alone if that's what you need. You have permission to feel however you actually feel instead of how you're supposed to feel. You have permission to stop performing. You have permission to be boring. You've been waiting for this permission your entire adult life. Waiting for someone to tell you it's okay to stop trying so hard. To stop spending so much. To stop pretending. To stop carrying the impossible weight of creating magic for everyone around you. So here it is. It's okay. You're allowed. You don't have to earn the right to rest. You don't have to justify choosing simplicity. You don't have to apologize for being human instead of being Santa Claus. Because Santa Claus isn't real. But your exhaustion is real. Your financial stress is real. Your need for rest is real. Your desire for authentic connection instead of performed joy is real. And all of those real things matter more than maintaining a fantasy. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but other people will be disappointed. Yes, they might be. Your mother might be hurt that you're not hosting Christmas dinner this year. Your children might be confused that there are fewer presents under the tree. Your partner might miss the elaborate decorations, and you'll feel guilty. You'll feel like you're letting people down. You'll feel like you're failing at Christmas. But here's the thing about boundaries. They always disappoint someone. Every time you choose your own well-being over someone else's expectations, someone will be disappointed. That's not a reason to sacrifice yourself. That's not a reason to keep performing a role that's destroying you. That's just the cost of being honest. And yes, there will be pushback. People will tell you you're being selfish. People will tell you you're ruining Christmas. People will tell you you're depriving your children, disappointing your family, missing the point of the holiday. But those people are wrong. They're not wrong because they're bad people. They're wrong because they're still trapped in the performance themselves. They're still trying to create magic through exhaustion. They're still measuring their worth by how perfectly they execute Christmas. And your choice to opt out threatens them. Because if you can have a meaningful Christmas without bankrupting yourself, without decorating perfectly, without cooking an elaborate feast, without giving expensive gifts, then maybe they could too. And that's terrifying. Because it means all their effort, all their stress, all their sacrifice might have been unnecessary, might have been a choice, not a requirement. So they'll pressure you to keep performing, to maintain the collective fantasy, to not break the spell. But But you don't owe them that. You don't owe anyone your well-being. You don't owe anyone your financial security. You don't owe anyone a performance of joy you don't feel. What you owe yourself is honesty. Honesty about what you actually need. Honesty about what actually nourishes you. Honesty about what Christmas actually means to you beneath all the cultural programming. And if the honest answer is not much, or something very different from what I've been doing, or I don't know, but definitely not this, that's valid. That's allowed. That's okay. You're allowed to invent your own Christmas. A Christmas that serves you instead of exhausting you. A Christmas that reflects your values instead of Madison Avenue's values. A Christmas that feels real instead of performed. And if other people don't like it, that's information about them, not about you. It's information that they're more invested in the fantasy than in your actual well-being. And you get to decide what to do with that information. Maybe you have a conversation. Maybe you set a boundary. Maybe you let them be disappointed. But you don't sacrifice yourself to maintain their comfort. Because here's the secret. Most people, once they adjust to the change, will actually be relieved. Relieved that someone finally gave them permission to stop performing too. Relieved that the exhausting competition is over. Relieved that they can finally be honest about how they actually feel about Christmas. You might be the person who gives your entire family permission to do Christmas differently. Permission to choose connection over consumption. Permission to choose rest over stress. Permission to choose reality over fantasy. And that might be the greatest gift you ever give them. Not a product. Not a performance, but permission. Permission to be human. Permission to be enough. Permission to let the sleigh stay imaginary, because the sleigh was always imaginary, and you were always real, and real is what we actually need. So what does a post-sleigh Christmas actually look like? What survives when you strip away the fantasy, the performance, the industry, the pressure? Let me tell you what I've learned from the people who've already made this shift. The people who've chosen boring, chosen quiet, chosen real. Their Christmases look nothing like the commercials, and they're better for it. Some of them spend Christmas alone by choice. They wake up late, make coffee, read a book, watch movies they love, take a long walk, light candles as evening falls. They report feeling more peaceful, more content than they ever felt during the years of forced family gatherings and gift exchanges. Some of them gather with chosen family instead of blood family. Friends who actually like each other. Who don't have decades of resentment and expectation weighing down every interaction. They cook together, play games, tell stories, laugh, real laughter, not performed cheer. Some of them still gather with family, but on different terms. No gifts or only handmade ones. Potluck meals instead of one person cooking for days. Shorter gatherings. Clear boundaries about topics that are off limits. They report that their families, after the initial shock, adapted. And that the relationships actually improved when the pressure of perfect Christmas was removed. Some of them create new traditions entirely. Christmas morning volunteer shifts at homeless shelters. Christmas Day hikes in nature. Christmas movie marathons. Christmas as a day of rest and reflection. Whatever feels meaningful to them, instead of what they're supposed to do. And here's what they all have in common. None of them miss the sleigh. None of them miss the performance. None of them miss the exhaustion, the debt, the stress, the forced cheer. They miss nothing about the fantasy Christmas, because what they have now is better. Not more exciting, not more impressive, not more Instagram-worthy, but more real, more nourishing, more sustainable, more honest. The Christmas that survives when you strip away everything else is surprisingly simple. It's the winter solstice instinct, the human need to create light in darkness, warmth in cold. It's the impulse to gather with people you care about and share what you have. It's the desire to mark the passage of time, to acknowledge that another year has passed, that you're still here, that survival itself is worth celebrating. It's the choice to be kind, to be generous, to be present, not because you have to, not because someone's watching and judging, but because those are values you actually hold. That's what survives. Everything else, the sleigh, the reindeer, the elaborate gifts, the perfect decorations, the manufactured magic, that's all optional. And for many people, it's not just optional. It's actively harmful. It's the thing preventing them from accessing the real Christmas underneath. So they let it go. And they discover that Christmas doesn't disappear when you remove the fantasy. It gets clearer. Like cleaning a window that's been covered in so much decoration you forgot there was a view behind it. The view is still there. It always was. It's just simpler than you thought. Less impressive maybe, but more true. The Christmas that survives is the Christmas that was banned in 1685. The quiet one. The private one. The human one. The one that doesn't require spectacle to matter. The one that exists in the space between survival and celebration. The one that says, the world is hard and winter is cold, but we're here together, and that means something. That Christmas never needed a sleigh. It never needed magic. It never needed anything more than what humans have always had. The capacity to create warmth, to share resources, to care for each other. That's the Christmas that survives every ban, every cultural shift, every attempt to commercialize or sanitize or perfect it. Because it's not based on fantasy. It's based on need. And the need is real. The need for connection, for rest, for light in darkness, for the acknowledgement that we don't have to face winter alone. That's what Christmas is. That's what it always was. Everything else is just decoration. And decoration is optional. We've arrived at the end of this story. And if you've been waiting for me to tell you that actually the sleigh does exist, that the magic is real, that there's a way to make the fantasy work, I'm going to disappoint you. The sleigh doesn't exist. It never did. And that's not a tragedy. That's a liberation. Because as long as you're waiting for the sleigh, you can't appreciate what you actually have. As long as you're measuring your Christmas against an impossible fantasy, your real Christmas will always feel inadequate. As long as you're performing magic for other people, you can't experience the genuine warmth of human connection. The sleigh isn't coming. Santa isn't real. And Christmas is just a day in December when humans choose to be slightly kinder, slightly more generous, slightly more intentional about connection. That's all it is. That's all it ever was. And that's enough. More than enough. Because the alternative, the fantasy, the performance, the exhausting attempt to create magic through consumption, that's what's actually killing Christmas. That's the real ban. Not the Puritan ban of 1685, but the modern ban, the cultural ban. The ban we impose on ourselves when we decide that reality isn't good enough. When we decide that our love isn't valuable unless it comes with expensive gifts. When we decide that our homes aren't beautiful unless they're perfectly decorated. When we decide that our gatherings aren't meaningful unless they match the fantasy. That's the ban that's destroying Christmas. And the only way to lift it is to stop believing in the sleigh. To stop waiting for magic. To stop performing. And to start being present. Really present. Not for the Christmas that's supposed to happen, but for the Christmas that's actually happening. The one where your family is imperfect. Where your gifts are modest. Where your decorations are simple or non-existent. Where your feelings are complicated. Where nothing is perfect, but some things are real. That Christmas. The boring, quiet, imperfect Christmas. That's the Christmas worth having. Because it's the only one that's true. The only one that's sustainable. The only one that actually nourishes instead of depletes. And here's the beautiful thing. When you stop trying to create the fantasy, when you stop performing, when you let go of the sleigh, you create space for something unexpected. Not magic, but meaning. Real meaning. The meaning that comes from honest connection, from vulnerable presence, from choosing each other, not because you have to, not because it's Christmas, but because you want to. That's worth more than any sleigh. Worth more than any pile of gifts. Worth more than any perfect Instagram Christmas. So this December, maybe try something radical. Let the sleigh go. Stop waiting for it. Stop trying to manufacture it. Stop measuring yourself against it. And instead, ask yourself, what do I actually need? Not what am I supposed to want? Not what everyone else expects. But what do I actually need to feel nourished, connected, human? Maybe that's solitude. Maybe that's one meaningful conversation. Maybe that's rest. Maybe that's simplicity. Maybe it's a pot of soup and a candle and permission to feel whatever you feel. Maybe it's the acknowledgement that you survived another year, and that's worth marking, even quietly. Maybe it's the choice to create a little warmth in the cold. Not for Instagram. Not for other people's approval. Not to prove anything. Just because you can. Just because choosing warmth over coldness is what humans do. That's Christmas, the real one. The one that was banned in 1685 and forgotten in the centuries since. The one we're finally, slowly, quietly remembering. The Christmas that doesn't need a sleigh because it never did. The Christmas that survives. So here we are, at the end of this journey through 340 years of Christmas history. And the answer to the question we started with, why was Santa's sleigh banned in 1685, and what did they do instead, turns out to be more complicated and more simple than we thought. The sleigh was never literally banned, but the spirit of Christmas, the human, messy, authentic celebration of survival and connection, that was banned. By Puritans, by industrialization, by capitalism, by our own impossible expectations. And what people did instead was what humans always do when joy is forbidden. They found it anyway, in whispers, in small gestures, in quiet gatherings behind closed doors, in the refusal to let fear or exhaustion or cultural pressure completely extinguish the small flame of human warmth. That's the Christmas worth recovering. Not the sleigh, not the fantasy, but the quiet, boring, beautiful act of choosing connection in the middle of winter, of sharing what little you have, of being present, imperfect, and real. That Christmas is still here, waiting for you, not in the sky, but in your own hands, in your own choices, in your own capacity to create warmth where there is cold, light where there is dark, connection where there is isolation. You don't need a sleigh for that. You never did. You just need to be human, and to let that be enough. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with this strange, dark, beautiful exploration of a holiday we thought we knew. If it made you uncomfortable, good. That means it was true. And if you choose to do Christmas differently this year, quieter, simpler, more real, know that you're not alone. You're part of a long tradition of people who refuse to let Christmas be taken from them, who refuse to let it be commercialized into meaninglessness, who chose boring over spectacular, and found that boring was actually sacred. Subscribe if this spoke to something you've been feeling but couldn't name. Share it if you know someone who needs permission to let go of the fantasy. And this December, whatever you choose to do it honestly. Do it for yourself. Do it without the sleigh. And see what happens. Merry Christmas. The real one.